October 15th, 1944. Dawn breaks across the rolling farmlands of Nebraska, casting long shadows through cornfields that stretch beyond the horizon. The morning air carries the scent of fertile earth and ripening grain, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic clatter of a John Deere tractor cutting through golden wheat. In a modest farmhouse kitchen, steam rises from a cast-iron skillet where thick strips of bacon sizzle alongside fresh eggs, their yolks gleaming like amber jewels. The farmer's wife, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's bread-making, sets a pitcher of fresh cream beside a plate stacked high with buttermilk pancakes. Outside, German prisoners of war, their gray uniforms dulled by months of captivity, lean against a wooden fence, watching this simple American morning unfold with expressions that speak of something far deeper than mere hunger. This moment, seemingly ordinary in its pastoral simplicity, would shatter the carefully constructed worldview of thousands of German soldiers who had crossed an ocean to fight for the Third Reich. For these men, raised on promises of Aryan superiority and German destiny, the sight of American abundance in its most basic form would prove more devastating than any Allied artillery barrage. They had come to America as prisoners, expecting to find a nation weakened by decadence and racial mixing, a people soft from prosperity and unworthy of their dominance. Instead, they discovered a truth that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The very farmers they had been taught to despise lived better than the officers who had commanded their loyalty. The German war machine had sustained itself on mythology as much as steel and gunpowder. From the beer halls of Munich to the training grounds of Prussia, soldiers had been indoctrinated with tales of American weakness, of a nation divided against itself, where the common man lived in squalor while Jewish financiers and corrupt politicians hoarded wealth. Heinrich Himmler himself had proclaimed that Americans were a mongrel race, weakened by luxury and incapable of true sacrifice. German propaganda films depicted American cities as sprawling slums punctuated by gleaming towers, accessible only to the elite, while the heartland supposedly teemed with impoverished farmers scraping subsistence from depleted soil. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, had carried these beliefs across the Atlantic like a sacred text. Raised in a village outside Dresden where his family had struggled through the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, he had joined the Wehrmacht believing that German discipline and sacrifice would ultimately triumph over American excess. His rations during the war years had consisted of black bread, thin soup, and ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. On good days, perhaps a small portion of stringy meat or a few potatoes. His officers, while dining slightly better, had shared the same fundamental scarcity that defined German wartime existence. The shock began during transport to the prisoner of war camps scattered across the American Midwest. Peering through the slats of railroad cars, German POWs witnessed endless fields of corn and wheat, pastures dotted with fat cattle, and grain elevators that rose like cathedrals from the prairie towns. The abundance seemed almost theatrical in its excess, as if America were staging an elaborate performance for their benefit. Many prisoners initially dismissed what they saw as propaganda, convinced that they were being transported through carefully selected routes designed to demoralize them. Camp Concordia in Kansas housed over 4,000 German prisoners, including many who had served in elite units such as the Afrika Korps and the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions. These men, accustomed to viewing themselves as representatives of a superior civilization, found themselves working alongside American farmers whose casual prosperity defied every assumption they had carried about their enemies. Private Johann Müller, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "The American Guards eat meat every day. Not just the officers, but common soldiers whose boots are better than those worn by our generals. They discard bread that would feed a German family for a week." The prisoners were assigned to work details on local farms, desperately needed to replace American agricultural workers who had gone to war. It was here, amid the bounty of American soil, that the full scope of their delusion became apparent. The farmers who employed them lived in houses that would have been considered mansions in wartime Germany, complete with electric lighting, indoor plumbing, and kitchens equipped with refrigerators that held more food than most German families had seen in years. Walter Schmidt, a former sergeant in the Wehrmacht's Sixth Army, found himself working on a dairy farm outside of Topeka. His American employer, a man named Frank Harrison, was what Germans would have classified as a simple peasant, a man who worked with his hands and lived off the land. Yet Harrison's breakfast table groaned under the weight of fresh eggs, thick-cut bacon, sausages, pancakes dripping with maple syrup, and milk so rich it left a thick cream line in the glass pitcher. The coffee was real, not the chicory and grain substitute that had become standard in German homes. Harrison's children, rather than the malnourished waifs that German propaganda had promised, were robust and healthy, their cheeks ruddy from good nutrition and outdoor play. The symbolic power of food permeated every aspect of the prisoners' experience. In Germany, the black bread had become a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, carefully rationed and never wasted. German mothers had taught their children to treat each crumb as precious, to understand that abundance was the enemy of character, that hunger built strength of will. Yet here in America, white bread was so common that farmers fed the crusts to their pigs. The abundance was not merely material, but philosophical. It represented a fundamental difference in how these two societies understood human worth and potential. Franz Weber, captured at Normandy, worked on a pig farm in Iowa where the swine ate better than many German civilians. The farmer, Tom Bradley, casually mixed corn, soybeans, and kitchen scraps into a feed that contained more protein than Weber had consumed in months before his capture. Bradley's wife would bring lunch to the workers, thick sandwiches of roast beef or ham, with slices of cheese and fresh vegetables, accompanied by cold milk or lemonade. Weber watched in amazement as Bradley's teenage son, perhaps 17 years old, consumed more food in a single meal than a German soldier's daily ration. The documentation of this cultural shock appears throughout the letters and diaries that prisoners managed to smuggle back to Germany, despite censorship. Corporal Ernst Hoffmann wrote to his brother in Munich, "You cannot imagine the abundance here. The farmers live like our industrial barons, yet they speak of themselves as common men. They have machines that do the work of 50 men, barns larger than our village church, and food that they cannot even consume. I begin to understand why they were able to build so many tanks and planes." The psychological impact went beyond mere material comparison. These German soldiers had been raised to believe that sacrifice and hardship were virtues, that a superior people could endure deprivation better than their enemies. The Nazi ideology had taught them that Americans, corrupted by Jewish influence and racial mixing, had lost the ability to suffer for their beliefs. Yet the evidence before their eyes suggested otherwise. American farmers worked as hard as any German peasant, yet they prospered in ways that seemed almost mythical. The seasonal rhythms of American agriculture provided a constant reminder of this abundance. During harvest time, prisoners watched as combines moved through wheat fields like mechanical leviathans, gathering grain in quantities that dwarfed anything they had witnessed in Europe. The waste seemed criminal to German eyes, grain that fell to the ground and was left for wildlife, corn that remained unharvested because the yield was so great that storage became a problem rather than scarcity. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Ehrmann, the highest-ranking officer at Camp Concordia, struggled to maintain discipline and morale among his men as the reality of American prosperity sank in. His own worldview, carefully constructed through years of Nazi education and military service, began to crumble as he witnessed the casual abundance that surrounded them. In his private writings, later discovered by American intelligence, he documented his growing despair. "We were taught that democracy makes men weak, that only through struggle and hierarchy can a nation achieve greatness. Yet, these Americans, with their chaotic politics and mongrel races, have created a prosperity that makes our greatest achievements seem like the fumbling of children. The symbolic significance of a single loaf of bread became a recurring motif in prisoner accounts. In Germany, bread was dark, dense, and carefully rationed. Each family received their allocation based on work status and party membership. Children learned to savor each bite, to understand that bread represented the state's benevolence and their own sacrifice to the greater good. American bread was white, soft, and abundant to the point of waste. Farmers' wives baked fresh loaves daily, often giving the day-old bread to livestock. The contrast was not merely nutritional but ideological. In Germany, bread was a tool of control and rationing. In America, it was a symbol of plenty taken for granted. Dr. Martin Sommer, a Wehrmacht medical officer captured in Italy, worked in the camp infirmary where he witnessed the physical transformation of his fellow prisoners. Men who had arrived gaunt and hollow-eyed from the deprivations of war began to fill out under the influence of American rations. The irony was bitter. As prisoners of war, they ate better than they had as soldiers of the Reich. American prison camp meals included meat multiple times per week, fresh vegetables, dairy products, and portions that would have been considered generous in peacetime Germany. The autumn of 1944 brought harvest festivals throughout rural America, celebrations that seemed to mock everything the German prisoners had been taught about their enemies. They watched as farm families gathered to give thanks for abundance that appeared limitless, where children played among pumpkins the size of wagon wheels and corn mazes that stretched across acres of fertile land. The waste at these celebrations, food that was prepared but not consumed, decorations made from grain and vegetables, represented more agricultural wealth than entire German villages had seen in years. The psychological warfare was unintentional but devastating. American farmers, unaware of the ideological crisis they were precipitating, treated their German workers with casual friendliness. They shared their lunch tables, invited prisoners to family gatherings, and spoke openly about their lives, their aspirations, and their casual assumptions about prosperity. Frank Harrison, the dairy farmer from Topeka, told Walter Schmidt about his plans to expand his operation after the war, to buy additional land and modernize his milking equipment. The ease with which he discussed these ambitions, not as distant dreams but as reasonable expectations, illustrated a mindset that German prisoners found incomprehensible. The letters that managed to reach Germany carried seeds of ideological doubt that would eventually blossom into broader disillusionment. Families who received these accounts of American abundance initially dismissed them as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize the home front. Yet as more letters arrived containing similar descriptions from prisoners held at different locations, the consistency of the accounts became impossible to ignore. German civilians, struggling with rationing and bombing raids, began to question what they had been told about their enemies and themselves. Private Heinrich Schultz, working on a chicken farm in Missouri, documented the casual abundance that surrounded egg production in America. The farm produced thousands of eggs daily, shipping them by railroad to distant cities. Schultz had been raised on a small farm in Bavaria, where chickens were precious resources, carefully tended and protected. Here, chickens lived in coops the size of German barns, fed grain that was fresher and more abundant than what German soldiers received. The farmer's wife gathered eggs in baskets that would have represented weeks of protein for a German family. Yet these were merely part of daily commerce, sold for prices that American workers could easily afford. The symbolic power of American abundance extended beyond food to encompass the entire material culture that surrounded the prisoners. Farm equipment that represented the height of German industrial achievement was considered obsolete by American standards. Tractors that would have been showcased at German agricultural exhibitions were relegated to secondary tasks on American farms. replaced by newer models with capabilities that seemed almost fantastic. The waste inherent in this constant upgrading, perfectly functional equipment, discarded or sold cheaply to make room for improvements, demonstrated a prosperity that transcended anything the German prisoners had imagined possible. The winter of 1944-45 brought a new dimension to the prisoners' education. American farms weathered the cold months with heating systems that maintained comfortable temperatures throughout houses that were larger than German civic buildings. Livestock lived in heated barns, protected from the elements with a care that exceeded what many German civilians received. The contrast was particularly striking for prisoners who had experienced the brutal winter retreats on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers had frozen to death for lack of adequate shelter and supplies. The documentation of American abundance became an obsession among the more educated prisoners, who recognized that they were witnessing something historically significant. Major Friedrich von Seckendorf, a career officer from an aristocratic Prussian family, maintained detailed notes on American agricultural practices, trying to understand how a nation could achieve such productivity without the rigid hierarchies and careful resource management that German theory demanded. His observations, smuggled back to Germany through Red Cross channels, painted a picture of American farming that seemed to violate every principle of economics and social organization that had been drilled into German minds. The transformation of German prisoners' understanding went beyond material comparisons to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. They had been taught that democracy was chaos, that racial mixing led to weakness, that comfort bred decadence. Yet the American farmers they worked alongside combined casual prosperity with evident strength, democratic participation with effective organization, and racial diversity with social cohesion. The cognitive dissonance created by these observations forced many prisoners to question not just Nazi propaganda, but the entire framework of assumptions that had shaped their worldview. The spring planting season of 1945 provided a final lesson in American abundance. Prisoners watched as farmers planted crops with a casual confidence that assumed good weather, adequate rainfall, and stable markets. German farmers, by contrast, approached each planting season as a desperate gamble against forces largely beyond their control. American seed came in quantities that seemed wasteful, with extras stored against the possibility of replanting if weather damaged initial crops. The machinery used for planting was precise and efficient, covering vast acreages with minimal human labor, while ensuring optimal spacing and depth for each seed. The news of Germany's surrender reached the prison camps in May 1945, but for many prisoners, the ideological surrender had occurred months earlier amid the cornfields and cattle pastures of the American Midwest. The men who had crossed the Atlantic believing in German superiority found themselves confronting evidence that their most basic assumptions about enemies and allies, about strength and weakness, about the relationship between suffering and virtue, had been fundamentally wrong. Sergeant Klaus Zimmermann, captured during the Ardennes offensive, worked on a vegetable farm in Illinois where he witnessed the preparation for victory gardens throughout the community. American civilians, despite their abundance, voluntarily grew additional food to support the war effort. The paradox was striking. A people who already lived in plenty choosing to work harder to ensure victory, while Germans, who had been promised glory, found themselves defeated despite their sacrifices. The victory gardens represented more than agricultural production. They symbolized a democratic people's voluntary commitment to a cause they believed in. Rather than submission to authority they feared. The abundance of American agriculture extended to the social structures that surrounded it. Farm communities maintained schools, libraries, and churches that served populations scattered across vast distances. The infrastructure of rural democracy, town halls, volunteer fire departments, cooperative grain elevators, demonstrated an organizational capacity that achieved German efficiency without German authoritarianism. Prisoners observed town meetings where farmers debated local issues with a freedom of expression that would have been unthinkable under Nazi rule. Yet these discussions led to practical decisions and effective action. The psychological impact of witnessing American abundance while their homeland collapsed under Allied bombing created a crisis of meaning for many German prisoners. Letters from home described cities in ruins, families struggling for basic survival, and a society that was disintegrating under the weight of total war. Meanwhile, the American farms where they worked continued their seasonal rhythms of plenty, largely untouched by the global conflict, except for the absence of some young men who had gone to fight in distant lands. Dr. Hans Müller, a Wehrmacht surgeon who worked in the camp hospital, documented the health improvements he observed among German prisoners fed on American rations. Men who had arrived with the nutritional deficiencies common among German soldiers, scurvy, anemia, and various vitamin deficiencies, recovered quickly under the influence of American prison food. The irony was profound. Defeat and captivity had improved their physical condition more than victory and service to the fatherland ever had. The approaching end of the war brought new revelations as American newspapers reached the camps, carrying reports of concentration camps liberated by Allied forces. German prisoners, who had been told that such stories were enemy propaganda, found themselves confronting photographs and testimony that documented atrocities committed in their nation's name. The contrast between American abundance and German brutality became even more stark when viewed against this backdrop of revealed horror. The sound of American prosperity became as significant as its sight. The prisoners heard the constant hum of machinery, the rumble of trucks carrying grain to market, the lowing of well-fed cattle, and the voices of farm families whose conversations assumed a future of continued plenty. These sounds contrasted sharply with their memories of wartime Germany, the silence of shuttered factories, the thin cries of hungry children, and the whispered conversations of people afraid to speak their doubts aloud. The symbolic weight of a single ear of corn recurred throughout prisoner accounts as a representation of everything they had misunderstood about America. German corn was a coarse grain, fit mainly for animal feed and industrial uses. American sweet corn was a delicacy, eaten fresh from the stalk and sweet enough to serve as dessert. Farmers grew it in quantities that allowed for waste, often letting prisoners take ears directly from the field for their own consumption. The casual abundance of this single crop represented a prosperity that transcended anything German agricultural science had achieved. The harvest moon of September 1945 illuminated scenes that had become routine yet remained miraculous to German eyes. Combines worked through the night, their headlights cutting through darkness as they gathered grain that would feed millions. The waste inherent in mechanical harvesting, grain scattered on the ground, stalks cut and left to decompose, represented more food than entire German communities had seen in the war years. Yet this waste was accepted as the inevitable cost of abundance, a calculation that prioritized efficiency over conservation in ways that German minds found difficult to comprehend. The prisoners' transformation was not merely intellectual, but emotional. Men who had marched across Europe singing Nazi anthems found themselves humming American folk songs learned from farm radio broadcasts. They developed personal relationships with American families who treated them not as ideological enemies, but as fellow human beings caught in the machinery of war. These relationships, forbidden by military protocol but encouraged by American civilian hospitality, provided insights into democratic culture that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. The winter preparations on American farms provided a final education in abundance. Root cellars filled with preserved vegetables, smokehouses stocked with cured meats, and granaries holding enough grain to last until the next harvest demonstrated a security that German farming communities had never achieved even in peacetime. The casual confidence with which American farmers approached winter, not as a season of potential starvation but as a time of rest and preparation for spring planting, illustrated a relationship with nature that was fundamentally different from the desperate struggle that characterized German agriculture. The news of atomic bombs dropped on Japan reached the camps in August 1945, providing a final demonstration of American productive capacity. The prisoners learned that while they had been working alongside farmers whose prosperity seemed almost magical, American factories had been developing weapons that redefined the nature of warfare itself. The same industrial capacity that created agricultural abundance had produced nuclear weapons, demonstrating a technological and organizational achievement that dwarfed anything the Third Reich had accomplished. As the war ended and repatriation became reality, many German prisoners faced the prospect of returning to a homeland that lay in ruins with a mixture of duty and dread. They had experienced abundance and witnessed democracy in action. They had seen strength that did not require brutality, prosperity that did not demand the oppression of others, and diversity that strengthened rather than weakened the social fabric. The contrast between what they were returning to and what they were leaving behind created a psychological burden that many would carry for the remainder of their lives. The final harvests of 1945 provided a poignant backdrop for the prisoners' departure. The same fields that had shocked them with their abundance continued their seasonal rhythms, largely indifferent to the ideological crisis they had precipitated in German minds. American farmers, having benefited from prisoner labor during critical war years, often expressed genuine regret at their departure. The casual friendships that had developed across cultural and linguistic barriers demonstrated the human connections that authoritarian ideologies tried to prevent. October 15th, 1945. One year after that first shocking dawn in Nebraska, the last German prisoners prepare for repatriation from Camp Concordia. The same prairie wind that had carried the scent of American abundance now carries the smoke from distant trains that will take them home to a Germany they no longer recognize, either in their memories or their expectations. In farmhouse kitchens across the Midwest, families prepare the same abundant breakfasts that had shattered German assumptions about American weakness. The bacon still sizzles, the coffee remains real, and the cream continues to rise to the top of fresh milk. But the German eyes that had witnessed this casual miracle are turning eastward, carrying with them the knowledge that everything they had been taught about strength and sacrifice, about superiority and destiny, had been built on foundations of sand. The letters they would write to families in the rubble of German cities would carry seeds of democratic understanding that would eventually bloom in the soil of a reconstructed Europe. They had discovered that abundance was not the enemy of character, but its foundation, that democracy was not chaos, but the highest form of organization, and that strength did not require the degradation of others, but flourished in their elevation. The farmers who had shared their tables and their harvests with enemy prisoners had demonstrated truths about human nature and social possibility that would outlast the ideologies that had brought these men to American soil as captives. In the end, the greatest victory of American democracy was not achieved on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but in the quiet moments when German prisoners of war sat at American kitchen tables, sharing meals that were more abundant than anything their officers had enjoyed, witnessing a prosperity that was built not on conquest, but on freedom, not on the suffering of others, but on the elevation of the common man to a dignity that authoritarian minds could neither comprehend nor duplicate. The sound of their weeping, as they finally understood what they had lost in following false prophets of racial destiny, became the echo of a discredited ideology, mourning its own demise in the face of democratic abundance. The corn still grows golden in the Nebraska sun, the cattle still graze in Illinois pastures, and American farmers still sit down to breakfasts that would humble kings. But somewhere in the rebuilt cities of Germany, old men remember a time when they learned that the true strength of nations lies not in the iron discipline of their armies, but in the simple prosperity of their people, not in the glory of conquest, but in the quiet abundance of democratic life. They learned that America's greatest weapon was not its industrial might or its atomic bombs, but its casual assumption that ordinary people deserved extraordinary plenty, and that this assumption, more than any ideology of blood and soil, represented the true destiny of human civilization.